There are two passages this morning. The first one is in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 to 15. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God has brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. The second passage is from Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." This is the word of the Lord. Be to God.
Well, think back to something that you really, really wanted for a long time. And then finally, you got it. It's good, right? But for how long were you satisfied? I think it happens to me every time I get a new phone. You get it and you unbox it, the new one, the best one they ever made. It's brilliant. But then, I don't know, a few months later, maybe a year later, I see the clever advertising for the next one. I think, maybe I need that one. The phone in my hand, it's okay, I guess, but I don't know, it's not really enough anymore. It only has like a 20x optical zoom. More seriously, I remember the first time I was promoted in my old public service job. It was a good feeling. I wanted it. I worked hard for it. I deserved it. I got my new business cards. I got to update my email signature with the new title. I got my bigger pay packet. I was one number higher to the top of the greasy pole. But by about 3 weeks later, I found myself thinking, when's the next promotion round? I need more. Maybe I should think about advancing diagonally. Maybe I should look at that other department's other job. Yeah. I mean, have you ever noticed that the wanting never really stops? It just goes away for a little while. You finally catch the thing that you're chasing, and for a moment you're satisfied, and you can rest happy. But then your eyes lift, and there is the next thing. It's an ancient problem. 3,000 years ago, the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible put it this way: the eye is not satisfied with seeing. You might have heard of the great theologian of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas. He asked once a simple question. He said, what would it actually take to satisfy the human heart's wanting? And the answer he came up with was everything. We would have to have everything, and every one. We would have to be infinite. But we're not infinite. And so I do not have enough. And who I am is not quite enough. And so I am restless. We're so used to chasing more and wanting more and the next one and the bigger one that we can end up working and striving like people who are never really allowed to rest and stop and be satisfied. And, it's almost a kind of slavery. Slaves must work until the master says, stop. Now, praise the Lord, we're not slaves. We are free in the literal sense. And as Christians, we are free in the spiritual sense. Jesus has set us free. But yet, it's so easy for human beings to get dragged back into never really resting. So we're in a sermon series on the Sabbath. We're in week 2 now. Last week we looked at stop. This week we're looking at being at rest or being content or satisfied. And you can't really rest while you're busy running, and you can't really rest while you're unsatisfied, always wanting more. And so the question we're sort of looking at is, if we're free, how is it we find ourselves working in a kind of slavery where we're not really free just to rest and be satisfied? We find an answer by going a long way back to a nation of actual slaves. Our first Bible reading that Deb read out this morning was from Deuteronomy chapter 5. And that was Moses preaching to Israel, giving them the 10 Commandments for the second time. And listen to how Moses frames the command to rest. Deuteronomy 5, verse 12, he says, "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days shall you work, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work." But why? The reason comes in verse 15. "You shall remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So did you catch it? The reason why they're commanded to rest is, remember, you were once slaves. Now, you might be aware that the 10 Commandments appear in the Bible twice. And the Sabbath command is framed slightly differently in each set. So the first time the 10 Commandments are given are in the book of Exodus. Moses is coming down from the mountain. God himself gave Moses the 10 Commandments on the tablets of stone and all that. And in the Exodus version of the commandments, the reason for the Sabbath command was God's creation. Like we looked at last Sunday, God worked for 6 days, and then he himself rested and stopped on the seventh. And then he wove this pattern of work and rest into the very fabric of time itself. It still maintains in the week. And human beings, made in the image of God, are to rest like our resting God. But in Deuteronomy, where we have the second reminder of the 10 Commandments, when Moses is preaching to Israel some 40 years later, that the reason for the Sabbath is different. It's not grounded in God's creation, it's grounded in God's rescue. Remember, you were a slave, but God brought you out of slavery where you were forced to work, but now he gives rest. So rest. Ancient Egypt that enslaved the Israelites was the world power and the center of global culture in its day. And it was the land of more. The slaves were literally building supply cities to store all the stuff. And Pharaoh's logic was simple. Slave makes bricks, slave builds empire, more slavery, more empire. And when the slaves had finished their bricks, make more bricks. There's a moment in the Exodus story where Pharaoh takes away the slaves' straw, which is needed to make bricks. And he keeps the quota for the bricks the same. So you've got the same target, but less to work with. It's an increase in productivity. or it's a heavier burden to squeeze every last ounce of labor out of the slave. And a slave in Egypt, does not get a day off. That the slave does not rest. He or she just powers down long enough that she can keep working again. Because a slave is not human. A slave is a unit of production. A slave is like a machine. A slave is worth what he or she produces or achieves. So Egypt was a hard master that allowed no rest. And we don't want that. We don't want it for ourselves. We don't want it for everyone else. We want to eliminate Egypt or the spirit of Egypt from the world, both here in Australia and elsewhere. We want to end unjust economic systems. But here's the thing. God delivered Israel out of Egypt and its unjust economic system in a single night. But getting the spirit of Egypt and its unjust economic system out of Israel took 40 years of wandering in the desert. It's like they internalized the spiritual chains of Egypt and had to learn the hard way to trust God into the freedom and the rest that he wanted to give them. They had to learn to rest. They had to learn to be free. And I wonder if it can maybe be a bit the same with us. We've been set free. We belong to Christ. The door to freedom and to the rest that he gives us, is wide open. But somehow we keep wandering back to Egypt. There's no literal Pharaoh standing over us with a whip, but we can find ourselves kind of picking up the quota all on our own and keep working. I got to get ahead. I want more than what I've got. I got to keep up. If I stop, I will fall back. And we even built a global economy around it. I mean, the modern West, promised us freedom and abundance, more choice, more comfort, more everything, more than any people in any generation have ever had. And it delivered. We've got far more, you and I, than our grandparents, ever even dreamed of. Let alone, little pharaohs in ancient Egypt. I've got air conditioning. Yet we're not happier. And yet we're still not satisfied. But we are the most anxious, most tired, most restless, most burnt out people in human history. We've got the freedom. We've got the choice. We've got all the stuff. And yet it's not enough. I just need a little bit more. Just the next thing. Maybe the AI productivity revolution, will finally lead us to that utopia when we will have everything we want and you'll never have to work again and life will be a seaside holiday. It won't, I promise you. Because the chains that keep us going for more, the chains that keep us from resting, the chains that kind of taints and ruins our social life, the chains are on the inside. You might remember him from last week, Augustine, 1600 years ago. He was compelled always to be chasing and wanting more. He went for more pleasure, more success, more career. At one stage, more religion. But he never, chasing the rainbow, he never caught enough. Until Jesus led him to the point where he could finally pray these words. He prayed, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." The rest that we long for, it's not going to come with more financial security or more achievement in the stellar career or more, keeping everything perfect at home. The rest that we long for comes with a rescue. We need someone to bring us out and help us rest from all our wanting and satisfy, the endless desire of the human heart. And a rescuer has come. It's Jesus. And he says the most dangerous thing that you can say to a slave master. He says, enough. Because our wanting more, our chasing, the striving that never lets us rest, never lets us be satisfied, at its core, it's a kind of worship. We have false gods in our culture. We don't build them temples like they did back in Egypt. We build them careers, or we build them portfolios, or we build them bigger and better lives, or perfect families. Two gods, really: accomplishment and accumulation. Achieve more, acquire more. And they're hungry gods. They never say, well done. They never say, that's enough now. They never say, take a break. They just say, more. And Sabbath, the practicing of setting aside a whole day to stop and to rest and to put down the tools, it's sort of like an act of resistance or even defiance, or it's an act of treason against the worst parts of our culture. It's you defying the false gods of achievement and accumulation, standing beside Jesus, and with him saying, enough. Remember who Jesus is. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's the one who leads his people out of slavery. He's the God and the King who gives his people rest. And the one thing that you must acquire, the one thing that you must achieve, which is peace with God Almighty, who made you in his image, Jesus has already achieved and already acquired on the cross. And he offers it to you freely. So in Jesus, you have enough. And in Jesus, you are enough. And so he calls to us, his people. He says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. In him we find the only thing that truly satisfies. And with him, we can resist the ceaseless wanting of more and the desire to keep going back and striving, even when we're tired. Because in Jesus, you have enough, and in Jesus, you are enough. So how do we live like this? The Israelites had to learn the hard way. And if you're anything like me, you probably have to learn the hard way too. And last week, we started. So our goal from last week's sermon was simply to pick and try a time for Sabbath and just stop. The practice of Sabbath is one practical way that we can draw closer to Jesus and build his rest into the rhythm of our lives. And so maybe you pick today, Sunday, to try that out. And if you did, I hope it's going well for you. But if last week got away from you and you didn't quite find a time to pick for Sabbath, that's okay, because we can start again this week, and you could even just pick like 1 hour this afternoon to let go and trust Jesus. But now, this week too, we go one step further. So last week's goal was simply to pick a time to try a Sabbath. This week's goal is to try and prepare well for Sabbath. So the day before, in particular, the day before your rest day, you might need to do some advance in preparation. You might need to do the shopping, you might need to tidy up, you might need to clear the errands and the messengers, and maybe think and plan of like one restful activity that you can do either by yourself or with others. So, and yeah, by the way, let me confess, I'm preaching to myself here. But plan ahead so that when your Sabbath comes, you're ready just to power down and rest. But also, if Sabbath is an act of resistance, if it's a swimming against the cultural tide, then we should expect some resistance back. And so when you try and stop, you might feel the pushback. And so part of learning to rest well and part of planning to rest is planning to deal with some of the resistance that might come. And it can come from two directions. First of all, there is external resistance. There are things, there's cultural forces that kind of get in the way of your resting. So you might need to plan just for a little bit to say enough to them. It's different for different people, but if it's for you, if it's like checking your work emails, you can plan to leave that for the next day. They'll wait. Maybe it's TV. Intentionally choosing a film or a TV show to watch, like good, purposeful rest, do it. But just passively watching the YouTubes, not so good. Maybe it's social media, maybe it's like Apple News or Google News. If they stir you up, just plan to put them away for a few hours. So if there's things that block your rest, make a plan to deal with one or two of them. But second, there's also sometimes internal resistance to Sabbath. Because when you finally sit still, everything that's going on for you just below the surface starts to surface. And for me personally, my rest day or my times of rest can be some of my most emotionally difficult. When you run hard during the week, with work, with study, with family, with all the goals, with all the responsibilities, you rarely have time just to process what's been happening lately. And so as I start to slow down, conflicts, anxieties, worries, pressures, my mind can sort of start to ruminate on them and, ruin my time off or make me miserable, or at least make everyone I'm around miserable. And to an extent, it's natural for this to happen. And to an extent, it's emotionally healthy for this to happen. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily enjoyable. But if something like that happens when you're starting to slow down or you're resting, don't be surprised, but rather name it, feel it, and hand it over to God. So you might also need to plan to deal with some internal resistance to Sabbath. And a way you can do this is like in your rest 2 hours or in your rest day, even for just 5 minutes, feel your emotions and just hand them over to God. Pray about them. Say, I don't know what to do with this. I'm angry, but you do. And if that's something that's new to you, that idea, in the Practicing the Way Sabbath guidebook that we're using at the moment for this sermon series, there's some great practical tips and help on how to do that, and I encourage you to have a look. So friends, pick a day to try Sabbath and plan for it. Be ready for your day of rest. Plan to deal with both external and internal blockers, barriers, resistance to your day of rest. But most of all, simply just come to Jesus and rest. Because in him, you have enough, and in him, you are enough. Amen.